Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the country. And thank you for joining us today for this NASPA live briefing, What's Up with Midterms? Policy Implications and Engagement Opportunities for the Non-Presidential Election Season. My name is Diana Ali. I work as the Assistant Director of Policy Research and Advocacy with NASPA. I've been working in that capacity doing policy analysis for over 2 years. But before I was doing that, I was doing advocacy-based work in the Chicagoland community, and I'm super interested in our topic today, which offers a means of elevating the voice of students across the country and emphasizing the important role of student affairs professionals in doing so. So I'm excited with that to turn it over to our guest speaker, Stephanie, who has been doing some incredible work on this front, and allow her to introduce herself and then move on into the presentation.
Right. Good afternoon and good morning, everyone. And thank you to my colleague Diana for inviting me to today's policy briefing presentation, What's Up with the Midterms, Policy Implications and Engagement Opportunities for the Non-Presidential Election Season. For those of you I haven't had the opportunity of meeting yet, my name is Stephanie King, and I serve as NASPA's Director of Civic Engagement and Knowledge Community Initiatives. Professionally, I've had the privilege of working on college campuses, specifically small private institutions, for about a decade before transitioning to the association almost 4 years ago. Where here I have the fortunate opportunity to work with NASPA's KC program, our NASPA LEAD initiative, which is committed to civic learning and democratic engagement at college universities, and the Voter-Friendly Campus program, which is a joint endeavor between NASPA and the Fair Election Center's Campus Vote project. Today I'm going to spend some time talking about engagement opportunities and trends that we're noticing as we're in the midst of election season, and then I'll turn it back over to Diana to talk a little bit more about where we see some policy implications for you to be aware of. With the midterm elections coming up and varying voter registration deadlines across states looming in October, many institutions of higher education and communities across the nation participated in what is known as National Voter Registration Day. This day traditionally falls on the fourth Tuesday of September, usually on or around September 25th. This day is supported by the National Association of Secretaries of State, also known as NAS, and is intended to boost the number of voters eligible to vote in November. This day of recognition started back in 2012, with organizers boosting over 750,000 voters registered across all 50 states as a result of its 2016 push during the presidential election season. In retrospect, this holiday has grown as the first National Voter Registration Day registered about 300,000 persons in 2012. And then conversely, this is even more remarkable in that for a midterm election in 2014, on National Voter Registration Day, about 154,000 people were registered. Whereas in today, 2018's National Voter Registration Day, we know that over 800,000 people have registered to vote. As you can see on the screen, there's a couple articles that we pulled some quotes from the Times as well as from CNN, which explains from Brian Miller, who helps to coordinate the NVRD efforts, that their goal was around 400 to 500 people, but that they were able to double that amount in this year, which means that we do see a heat wave of folks that are wanting to engage in the upcoming election. As we go through today's presentation, also in the chat function, I'll be sending links out to the audience. You can keep up to date with where this information is coming from in case you'd like to reference it at a later time. Also, in regards to voter registration efforts, I'd like to draw your attention to the National Conference of State Legislators so that folks are aware of the same day and election day registration regulations. As of March 2018, there are 17 states plus the District of Columbia that offer same-day registration, also known as SDR, which allows any qualified resident of the state to go to register to vote and to cast a ballot all in that same day. Additionally, the state of Washington has enacted same-day registration, but this won't be implemented until 2019. With the 15 states plus the District of Columbia that make same-day registration available on Election Day, this is sometimes called Election Day Registration, or EDR. So for folks in those states, they're colored purple on your screen, but you'll notice they're across the nation and spread as to where folks can be located. In addition, the 2 states which are colored yellow, which are Maryland and North Carolina, while they make same-day registration possible for a portion of their early voting periods, they do not offer this regulation during Election Day. For other states that are a part of early voting or the same-day registration process, we want to make sure that folks are aware that registering to vote usually varies by state, and it can occur between 8 and 30 days before the election. I wanted to share this information as a highlight, so while we do have 800,000 people that registered in November in accordance with National Voter Registration Day, if your students or staff or colleagues have missed the opportunity to register during that time period, it might not be too late for them to still engage in this upcoming midterm election. So please do make sure that folks are aware of their processes as they're gearing up for the election. I also have a couple of resources that I'll provide in the chat. As we've noticed, with early voting underway, we've seen an article in the New York Times recently, which published that on October 23rd, with millions have already voted in early voting in the midterms. And what does that mean and what does it do for us? I just want to make sure that you're aware that those pieces are coming out. You can also track 2018 November general election early voting results through a project called Elect Project, which will give you a day-by-day information of where our states are in terms of their voting efforts with early voting. So that information is also in the chat for you. And then a couple other articles that you can reference at a later date. Furthermore, I'd like to draw your attention to a couple links that are available through our partners at Nonprofit Vote, Rock the Vote, and National Voter Registration Day. These two links on your screen will allow you to check if you are currently registered, and if you're not, you can go ahead and register online if your state allows for online registration. It'll also give you the breakdown of which states have registration dates so that you can inform your campus or your colleagues and your students of when their registration deadlines were or are forthcoming if they haven't passed yet. The next thing that I want to make sure that folks are aware of is that we do partner with Campus Vote Project out of the Fair Election Center, and they pull together what we call student state voting guides. So you can click on any of the states there and it'll tell you the voter regulations. This project was created as one of the biggest barriers for students to register and vote is the lack of understanding of their registration deadlines, where they can vote, either their home or their school address, the ID requirements that they have, and other voting information. So absentee voting, mail by vote, registering online, things like that. And so we wanted to make sure that folks had that information readily available in case your students are having questions about their rights related to registration and processes. And moving a little bit beyond registration information, I do want to take some time to talk about engagement. In the next couple of slides, I'm going to share some data that is curated by our partners at CIRCLE, which is the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at the Jonathan M. Tisch College of Civic Life at Tufts University. While CIRCLE primarily focuses on the political life of young people in the United States, it's especially for those who are marginalized or disadvantaged. The information that is currently on your screen is from their report, So Much for Selectivism, as Youth Translate Online Engagement to Offline Political Action. Young people have often been labeled as disinterested or disengaged from the political process. While part of this criticism comes from lower voting rates among youth, some of it stems from the ways that youth choose to engage politically. With a broad uptake of social technologies among young people comes the ability to easily express their political identities in digital spaces. Social media especially allows for young people to easily support, promote, and engage in causes of interest. We often see an uptake in things of using the right click versus left click of our students liking social issues on platforms like Facebook, Instagram, and sometimes Snapchat, but not necessarily expressing those views by reading up on them, aka doing some left clicking, which we think about with media literacy. Therefore, some have turned this type of engagement called selectivism, with the idea that supporting a campaign or a politician online doesn't count as true activism. That framing hasn't told the whole story about millennials' political engagement. And Circle's polls find that it's even less true for a younger generation that is increasingly taking to the streets, engaging in other forms of offline political activism and connecting their activism to voting. Circle's data shows that young people ages 18 to 24 are now 3 times as likely to have attended a demonstration or march than they did in 2016. It was 5% then, it's 15% now in 2018. And other types of engagement like signing a petition are also up from 2 years ago. In terms of parties, you can think of it as young Democrats are more than twice as likely to engage in offline activism as young Republicans. That's a 37 versus 14% respectively. So when you're thinking of how your students are engaging, well, you might not be thinking that they're voting. They are engaging in different forms of political activism, which we think will have a translation to the polls in the coming weeks if it hasn't already. We too at NASPA would support this type of engagement or offline political activism that has been deemed as slacktivism. And in May of 2018, with the NASPA LEAD initiative, we produced the Effective Strategies for Supporting Student Civic Engagement, a Student Affairs Insight Brief. With recent protests and political events signaling the need for higher education institutions to take a closer look at the importance and significance of student activism college students experience, these out-of-classroom environments tend to be ripe with opportunities for students to process, communicate, and to engage. We provide this resource as an avenue for folks to think about how they themselves as practitioners and institutions of learning can help to support student activism movements on and off our college campuses. Furthermore, when we correlate the uptick in voter registrations as outlined earlier in this conversation and the uptake in engagement efforts in relation to student activism, such as petitions, demonstrations, etc., as supported by Circle's data, many are reporting that the 2018 midterms have the potential to be historic for youth political engagement or participation, especially with young people receiving campaign outreach, paying attention, and intending to vote at unusually high rates that come close to the levels of engagement seen in the 2016 presidential election. Circle reports that 34% of young people are extremely likely to vote in the upcoming 2018 election. Furthermore, young people who report being actively engaged with issue-based campaigns and messages, such as the post-Parkland movement for gun violence prevention, these persons are even more likely to say that they're extremely likely to vote. This Circle poll finds that 34% of young people ages 18 to 24 are extremely likely to vote in the midterms, which is interestingly that 18 to 21-year-olds, this election's newest voters who are not eligible to vote in 2016, report that they are extremely likely to cast ballots at a similar rate. That would represent a significant shift since the youngest young people have historically had lower voter turnouts than older youth. By comparison, Circle's 2016 pre-election poll found that only 40% of 18 to 24-year-olds were extremely likely to vote. If the data stays on trend, we should anticipate a significant uptake in students that are exercising their right to vote this fall. As I mentioned moments ago, those that seem most likely to vote in this year's election are those that have been contacted in an issue-based campaign. As Circle has emphasized in previous analysis, the likelihood to vote is strongly correlated with outreach to youth. In the results of their poll, currently on your screen, Circle found that youth who report having been contacted by a candidate's campaign or another organization supporting candidates are more likely to say that they will vote than those that have not been contacted, 49% to 28% respectively. Through Circle's polling process, the results have also indicated strong support overall for Democratic candidates in congressional elections, but large disparities among different demographic groups of young people, with Black and Latino youth much more likely to support Democratic candidates, young white men actually favoring Republicans, and unaffiliated white youth spreading their support across parties and ideologies, makes it a little bit more difficult for us to see the full shift of where we can predict that folks will be voting. In bridging the conversation of registered voters, student activism, contact for candidates, and poll findings that many young persons indicate that they are extremely likely to vote, some of you may be wondering, well, what's influencing the youth to turn out to vote, and how are they getting informed about processes, candidates, and issues? Young people are hearing about the elections from a range of sources. Their level of trust in these sources, along with other factors like their exposure to political parties and information, can influence how they perceive any election-related messaging, and what, if anything, it encourages them to do. Among Circle's survey respondents, family has been found to be the most common way young people are learning about the midterms. And 50% of youth who say they are extremely likely to vote are hearing from their family. So while we're doing outreach efforts through higher education institutions, we need to always be considering the home base of where our students, our colleagues, and our neighbors are coming from to understand more about their voting patterns and if they will or will not vote in this upcoming election and possibly in further elections. In shifting gears slightly away from young people, I'd like to share the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll from October 21st, which shows with just over 2 weeks to go until the midterms, among registered voters, Democrats hold a 7-point lead in the generic ballot. That's 48 to 41% respectively. That's down significantly from the 12-point lead Democrats held just a month ago, pre-Kavanaugh, when it was 52 to 40%. However, there's more to be said here. Among likely voters, the Democrats' lead grows, does not shrink. It grows to 9, 50% to 41% respectively. Here's why that's interesting. It's the first time ever in Wall Street Journal's polling history that their likely voter model shows a better number for the Democrats than the registered voter number. Normally in midterms, Republicans have the likely voter advantage. In the same poll, and furthermore, here's a brief correlation to presidential job approval / disapproval by this group and the correlation to the outcomes with the midterms. Here's President Trump sitting at 47% of an approval rating. That seems to be an improvement for him, but what would 47% job rating mean in the past when it comes to a midterm result? Well, for President Barack Obama, he had exactly that, a 47% job approval rating in 2010. His party lost 63 votes in the midterm elections. Bill Clinton in 1994, in the same time period, in October, had a 48% approval rating and lost 54 seats. So if history is to repeat itself, we may see some transitions coming in the weeks regarding party representation of our elected officials. For your reference, I've posted the full article about where these polling results came from in the chat function for you to reference at a later time. So in considering all that we've shared so far about electoral engagement, you may be wondering what more can we do to ensure that young people show up to vote and are educated about issues/candidates when casting their vote. Circle has also recently released the final report on a joint project conducted with the Opportunity for Youth United, or OYU, which aims to engage low-income young people and local election administrators to make electoral systems to be more responsive to these marginalized voter needs. The report, based on a survey of over 1,200 young people from 6 politically and geographically diverse states, puts forth 10 recommendations for elections administrators and youth allies that are interested in increasing electoral engagement. I've provided the 10 recommendations here for you to consider how you can continue working with the young people in your communities and at your institutions. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize the work that is being done by our campuses. With initiatives like Party at the Polls programming with Vote Together, which is based on the idea that from backyard barbecues and block parties to picnics and parades, that if we create celebrations around the voting process, we'll create more of a community of togetherness, which provides more of an openness to folks engaging in the electoral process. If you're thinking about it, they also offer a few grant funding opportunities for institutions to take advantage of to help support and offset these costs that your institution may incur by creating that sense of community around elections. We're also seeing a lot of innovative approaches when it comes to engagement in the elections with our institutions, such as with athletic challenges like SoCon Votes, where college organizers are playing on academic and football rivalries to launch voter turnout competitions. Before the November 6 midterm elections, schools in the Big Ten, have challenged each other to overcome traditionally low turnouts among college students. It truly is a vibrant time on our campuses to see engagement not only with our political science folks, but across student affairs and across institutions as a whole. Furthermore, we're also seeing an uptake in national initiatives getting involved in the midterm elections and the voting process. The 2 programs that I would highlight would be the All-In Campus Democracy Challenge, which is founded from Civic Nation, which strives to change civic culture and institutionalize democratic engagement activities, and provides merit awards for increased voter numbers in regards to registration and turnout by way of the NSOLVE program, which is the National Study of Learning and Voter Engagement, again out of IDHE's, the Institute for Democracy and Higher Education at Tufts University. And then we at NASPA also work with the Fair Election Centers for our voter-friendly campus program, which talks more about creating a cultural shift and institutionalization of voter engagement year-round. So those parties are there to help you. In addition, we did recently put out the Election Imperatives document, which is a collaborative practitioner-focused document that provides recommendations for what campuses can do to make 2018 an important moment for student political learning. Think about these 10 things as well as you want to implement different practices and approaches for your campus to engage in the 2018 election. Also noting that while the 2018 election is important, consider it a teachable moment about creating pathways for political and civic engagement year-round. Elections shouldn't be the end-all be-all. They should be a starting point for conversation and engagement on all of our campuses. And then lastly, as many of our institutions are preparing students or sending students out to vote, there's been a lot of question around what does it look like to make sure we have informed voters at the polls. Therefore, I would encourage you, if you haven't already, to guide your students or your colleagues to the Ballotpedia platform, which is a platform and a digital encyclopedia which helps to provide information on what's on your individual ballot. By using their site, you're able to type in your address of where you'll be voting at, and they'll be able to generate the items that'll be on your ballot from candidate backgrounds to issue statements to make sure you're informed before you reach the polls in the coming weeks, if not now, with early voting taking way. And with all that said, I'm going to turn the conversation over to Diana to talk about what implications there can be from the election outcomes and policy.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. So a lot of extremely fascinating information that you have shared with us today. If you do have questions at this time, please do put those in the questions box. I'm going to go through some policy outcomes and implications, but I do want to make sure that we get your questions. Even if we don't have time to answer them today, we can follow up with you on that. So within the case on this first slide of the governor's race, of the 50 governor's offices, 36 are actually up for election this year, which is a pretty big number. And this is important to note, and everything I'm trying to talk about here in terms of outcomes is really around what we can expect in terms of policy implication and impact. So this is important to note, the governor's race, because we have the 2020 census coming up, and the 2018 elected governors will provide oversight to redistricting that will occur following the census. The American Association of State Colleges and Universities estimates that post the 2020 census, redistricting will influence state and federal political power until 2032, so for over a decade. As many of you probably know, racial gerrymandering continues to be a substantial issue in this conversation around political districting, despite recent court rulings to thwart this from happening. And if you are interested in learning more about the conversation around political districting and racial gerrymandering, I do recommend that you check out NASPA Director of Policy Research and Advocacy, Terry Lynn Hines, who is actually on the call with us today. Her blog post, I on 18, All Politics Are Local, which is up on the NASPA RPI blog. This map on your screen right now, it has been retrieved from 538, and it's showing the likelihood of a state to vote along party lines. In my home state of Illinois, for example, we have between a 60 and 95% chance of voting Democrat, which would flip the political party in control for 2018. So it's all probability here. Folks don't know exactly what these outcomes are going to be, but this is some of the predictions around that. So moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about the congressional race. According to 538 again, there is a 6 in 7 chance that the House will flip parties, meaning that we will likely have a Democratic House and a Republican Senate. So this, again, I just want to really note here that all of these possible outcomes are based on statistical analyses, including the simulation, the election simulation presented here from Time. And much of the conversation also that we've been seeing in the media regarding, what are some strategic moves by the administration in order to sway voter turnout and that kind of a thing. It's all speculation right now, but we can consider some real possible implications in the next slide. So prior to the start of a new congressional cycle in 2019, we will enter into a lame duck session where our current elected officials will continue to consider a number of policies with potential impact to our higher education community, including that of the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women's Act, which is currently the funding for that has been extended until December 2nd through a consolidated spending bill, which was passed at the end of September. The Farm Bill will also be considered, most likely, under which impact to SNAP or food stamp benefits might change. And then also we might see a conversation around a pathway to citizenship for undocumented individuals, or any conversation around gaining permanency to the DACA program in exchange for funding to the border wall. And all of this that will be taken up during the lame duck session depends somewhat on election outcomes. Moving into the 116th Congress, should we see a flip in the House, there are a number of areas where we might see changing policy conversations, but I just wanted to touch on really quick here on the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act. Given that the Senate is traditionally more bipartisan than the House, and a Democratic House would have to tailor HEA legislation so that Republican senators would be likely to vote on it, a new HEA bill mirror entirely either the PROSPER Act, the Promoting Real Opportunity, Success, and Prosperity Through Education Reform Act, which came out through the House last December, or the Aim Higher Act, which was the House Democratic version of the HEA legislation, which was introduced more recently. So it's unlikely that this legislation will look exactly like either of these two pieces of legislation. But again, as Terry identified in her blog post, which I do recommend again that you check out, Crystal Balls and Casting Runes, Predictions for HEA Reauthorization in the 116th Congress, we may see continued support for low-income students. We may see a focus on deregulation and simplification to streamline funding efforts, and we might see updates to the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act in that HEA reauthorization coming up in the 116th Congress. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on really quickly is that given Democratic control in the House, we would see a change in the chairman of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, which could bring additional oversight to the Department of Education around some of the legality of consistent regulatory rollbacks that we've seen in the last 2 years by the Department of Ed. So, for example, in the case of the borrower defense to repayment rule, which recently a federal judge has ordered that the Department of Education start implementing the Obama-era regulations until newly proposed regulations actually go into effect in 2020. With this change in party, we might see some additional oversight in the form of holding hearings and issuing subpoenas and that kind of a thing from the House Committee on Education and the Workforce in order to make sure that Department of Ed is actually implementing those rules and ensuring that process. So the policy and advocacy team will continue to analyze midterm election policy implications, and we encourage you to join us for our town hall discussion on November 15th, hosted by the Public Policy Division, which will go more in depth on midterm election outcomes because it will be following the midterm elections, which are on November 6th. So look out for more information on that in NASPA's weekly update. It does seem like we have run out of time pretty much here. So I'm bringing us to our question slide. I'm going to check really fast if we do have questions from the audience. All right, sorry to have rushed you all towards the end, but please do reach out to Stephanie or I with any of your questions. There's a lot of content here. This is unlike, this is unlike many elections that we've seen in recent history, as I think Stephanie spoke to. And I just want to turn it over to Stephanie really fast to see if you have any closing thoughts or comments before it looks like we will have to go ahead and end today.
Thank you, Diana, for sharing those thoughts. For folks in the audience, if you do have questions or comments, I hope that you'll reach out to myself, Diana, and our other colleague, Terry, as we're here to be a resource for you and your campuses as you engage in this political process of ensuring that your students and your communities are educated and that you're able to exercise your rights to vote. And we also have some resources in case you have any infringements or are feeling voter suppression in your communities. Do let us know. We're here to be a resource for you in helping to overcome those barriers.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stephanie. And I hope everybody has a great day and tunes in for next month's policy briefing series. Goodbye, y'all.